Hello, I'm Casey Aiken, and this is 21 This Week. Coming up next, what is the latest on the Maryland race for governor? 60% of Democrats voted for someone other than Marc Elrich. Is it time for a change in how we vote in Montgomery County? Nationwide, pandemic caused dramatic decline in education. What happened here in Montgomery County, and how can we fix it? Our panel of insiders will give you the story behind the story. We're joined by former County Council member Mike Knapp and Secretary of the Maryland Republican Central Committee, Marc Uncapher. Stay tuned for these stories and more on the next 21 This Week. In years past, the Maryland governor's race traditionally featured two well-known politicians that came up through the party ranks. Think Marvin Mandel, Don Schaefer, and even Bob Ehrlich, excuse me. But this year's election offers something else. On the Democratic side, Wes Moore's background in finance and nonprofits couldn't be farther from the old school politics. On the Republican side, that candidate, Dan Cox, filed articles of impeachment against the sitting governor, not against a Democrat, but against Larry Hogan, who's another Republican. So, Mike, it may be too soon to identify any trends emanating from these results, but it seems that the electorate on both sides are dissatisfied with the status quo. They're in search of a new shiny object to believe in. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is, at least on the Democratic side. When I looked at kind of the primary candidates this year, and they were vast, and they were all names that people had known and many people had voted for. You had people like Francho and Gansler, who had both run statewide previously. I think people were interested in looking at somebody who wasn't the same person they'd always voted for, and recognize that there is change out there, and how do we find somebody who brings a little different perspective to the table to be able to take us in a different direction.
So I want to know about Wes Moore, but is there a generational shift here now? I mean, obviously, you know, Peter Francho was well known. He's a long time serving politician. Is there a generational shift now to younger and hopefully somewhat better?
Well, I think there is. It's interesting, you know, if you look at the Democratic primary, I mean, typically our Democratic primary voter is a more traditional, older Democratic voter. And so I think that you still have that, but I think that Wes presented a really compelling reason to look someplace different. I think he just brings a lot of different experiences and hasn't always been hasn't ever been in elected office. And I think people were genuinely excited by that.
So Marc, before we get into the particulars about candidate Cox, I mean, are Republican voters doing the same? Is there a generational shift here? Or what's the dynamics in your party?
It could be a generational shift, but I think you're right on the money that in both parties, there was a hunger for a departure from the sort of traditional approach, and in both parties chose sort of non-establishment, if you will, party establishment candidates to go forward. And I think it reflects something in the electorate that's looking for change.
Well, so what do we know about Dan Cox?
Dan Cox, I'm sorry. Yes, I mean, he's very much the representative of sort of the red state, Maryland. That chafed under Larry Hogan and thought that they could have their views represented that much more forcefully. And it really was a vote against the Hogan years, if you will, within the primary. I guess it's disappointing for those who supported Hogan, and we'll obviously see how it turns out in November.
Well, on every level, there seems to be sharp contrasts in the view of whether it's education, healthcare, environment, crime, gun control. There is a wide difference on how to address these issues. And even in the parties, there seem to be some, although I think the Democrats are more unified on this issue. On these issues.
That's nice for a change. We like that.
Really? So, you know, I just want to know, realistically, Mark, Maryland's a blue state, and the voters have to be angry, or the candidates have to be awful for a Republican to win. Can Cox pull off a surprise here?
Well, he faces a challenge. We talked about the issue of people looking for change. And obviously that's the case that he's going to be making, is that Wes Moore, as the teacher union endorsed candidate, really isn't that change, isn't that agent of change, and will simply reflect more of the same. And that's the case he needs to make to the voter, is that he presents a contrast between a more traditional way of approaching education and the views that he wants to see enacted.
So, Mike, I've always believed local issues are more important than national issues in these types of races. And we've seen this uptick in crime. We've seen a lot of stories about, tremendous drug use and going on in especially in Baltimore. Sorry, never get interrupted by a cell phone before. Anyway, in any event, are the local issues going to dominate, and will there see some voter unrest as a result thereof?
I don't know that they'll dominate. I mean, I think certainly the challenges that Baltimore continues to face continue to be something that every statewide candidate has to wrestle with and has to figure out how to address. I think, interestingly, Wes did well in Baltimore, did really well in Prince George's County, and I think, he did solidly well in Montgomery County. And so I think that collectively people are looking at the experiences that he brings. And interestingly, and I got to say I'm a little surprised at this, but very pleased. I think he represented probably one of the more moderate perspectives of those folks running in the Democratic primary. And so I think where Larry Hogan has been very effective at being able to reach across the aisle and identify those moderate Democrats and show that he could chart a more centrist path, I think that Wes presents a very similar approach to this year's race. I think he certainly has his progressive bona fides and has come from working in a philanthropic background at the Robin Hood Foundation and is focused on poverty issues. But by the same token, he's also a military veteran. And he has, I think, interesting credentials from that perspective as well. And I think while he has received some of the more traditional Democratic endorsements, I also think he's done a really nice job of kind of indicating that we're in this for everybody.
Well, you're going to have the last word here. And when we come back from this short break, we're going to take a look at the county executive race. And I will make a note that since my wife called to bring home the milk, I'll make sure that I put a note down on my calendar.
You said it's about the local issues. It really is.
It is always. I'm just glad that with the Biden inflation that I can afford some milk, Mike. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Think about this. 32 votes. Just 32 votes is what incumbent Marc Elrich won the Democratic primary by. 60% of Democratic voters cast ballots for someone other than Marc Elrich. And of course, most believe that he will go on to win the general election, meaning, of course, the Republican voters effectively have no voice in how the county is governed. Mark, is there something wrong with the system? And other states have gone to ranked voting. Is that a way to correct this imbalance? Or do we just need better candidates?
Well, I'm not sure about ranked choice. I know I've followed it and read a lot about it. It does create a huge challenge and in effect voter fatigue of, in order to have your vote count, you've got to rank candidates way down down a list. And I think in many ways it may create more problems than it corrects. Listen, the voters chose in the Democratic primary Marc Elrich, whether it's 32 votes or 32,000 votes, and he's the nominee.
Well, but I bet there are a few Republicans out there that wished they had switched party affiliations for this after the results of the primary were announced?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, perhaps 4 years ago, David Blair represented more of a contrast to Marc Elrich. I think a lot of Republicans, frankly, saw that he moved towards the, how shall I say, the left of the party this time, except on development issues. And so I'm not quite sure there was quite as much enthusiasm outside the Democratic Party for David Blair.
So, Mike, in sports, they call it a trap game, where an overwhelming favorite team doesn't take the contest seriously and loses to an inferior opponent. We saw this back in 2000 when Pat Baptiste was running in District 1 against Howie Dennis, didn't take the general election seriously and lost to Howie. And in this case, 60% of Democratic voters cast ballots for someone other than Marc Elrich. And so is it possible that they're going to sit out the general election or cast their votes for the Republican candidate, Reardon Sullivan?
No.
We don't like one-word answers, Mike.
I know, but it is quite that simple in Montgomery County. When you look at the voter registration and you look at how Democrats that typically haven't voted in the primary that then show up and vote in the general will vote very, very strongly Democratic, as will the Republican Party, because at that point there are also folks who are paying attention somewhat to local issues, but also are paying attention to those national issues. And so the reality is, and we're seeing this, there's a fair level of activism within the Democratic Party as a result of a lot of the more national issues that will, I think, get people out to vote locally. And as a result, I think you'll see a pretty overwhelming victory for Marc Elrich, in spite of the fact that there's clearly dissatisfaction within the Democratic Party for him as our lead candidate.
Well, Mark, the second largest voting bloc in Montgomery County are independents. They're not Republicans. And the independents haven't voted yet either. So are those independents going to come out and vote for Reardon, and is that a path to win?
Well, I think you put your finger on the issue is going to be turnout, and this may well be an election where we see a decrease in turnout compared with 4 years ago, and that changes the dynamic. If the Democrats that Mike described continue to turn out, then both Dan Cox and Sully have an uphill fight. On the other hand, we've talked about the desire for change and the dissatisfaction with the choices that folks have. I mean, even Wes Moore had lots of people voting not for Wes Moore in the primary. And so we'll see how that all shakes out as well.
Well, there are local issues at play. I mean, things have not been, wonderful in Montgomery County over the last 4 years. We've seen a spike in crime, a lot of crime, especially in Silver Spring. We've seen crime going into the western parts of the county that, you would thought no crime ever existed in around Churchill High School and other parts of the county. So, I mean, there are local issues that are going to be at play. And the question is, will they have any traction in this election? Michael, you first.
Sure.
No, I think it becomes an interesting challenge. The independents that you were talking about earlier, interestingly, while in most places those independents generally are moderate, interestingly in Montgomery County, a lot of those independents are actually further to the left and are much more Green Party candidates than kind of even traditional Democrats. And so it's interesting, or even our independents don't skew the way independents typically skew in other jurisdictions. And I think you're right. And I think that's why you saw the dissatisfaction, but I don't think the dynamics in a general election in Montgomery County, I just don't think the numbers are there to allow a Republican candidate to have that great a showing.
Mark, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
Well, I think people are looking for change, and I think it's going to be incumbent on the candidates to be able to present a case for how their change makes more sense than sort of the status quo approach.
Well, I think the problem for Reardon is is fundraising. That he has a message to get out. He's a very impressive guy. He's a local guy. Went to Wooten High School. So, I mean, he's got local roots. I think the problem is getting his message out, and we'll see what happens. we still a lot of time left between now and November. All right, on to our final topic, which is education. You know, the national COVID pandemic exposed a lot of things. There are many fissures that exist in our society, but none more so than in education, where the fear of the virus led to lockdowns and remote learning, which had their own dramatic effects, to the students. But, you know, there hasn't been a lot of data on how these lockdowns affected. Now the first reports of the damage that was caused is becoming apparent. Not the anecdotal statements, but statistically. In the first full-scale assessment of 9-year-olds since the pandemic, a report found a widening achievement gap between students of color and white counterparts. More shockingly, the report exposed that reading and math scores sharply declined in all grade levels. Mike, this has to be very worrisome for you because you're on the board of Montgomery College. And that means that the students that are matriculating and going to Montgomery College may not be ready for your programs. How to cure this?
How do you cure this? I don't know that there's a cure. And I suppose on the positive side, we've seen this pervasive across the entire country, which means children need much more intensive engagement early on in their learning years, and that's very clear. And so I think if anything, it teaches us that we've got to continue to double down and make sure we're doing what we're doing prior to third grade to make sure those students have the tools that they need. One of the things that we at Montgomery College have done and really worked hard at over the last 4 or 5 years is really trying to understand where our high school students are coming from and better meeting them where they're at. And so to really understand what is the quality of student, what's the caliber of student, what are the things that they know, really using their transcripts to understand where they're coming from and being able to be more malleable in the programs that we can provide at the community college level to help bridge that gap. We've realized that students don't come to Montgomery College or to community college in general to not be successful. And so we've got to be able to help get them where they are, provide them the tools they need early on. And if they need help in reading, they need help in math, getting them that, and then allowing them to be more successful in their college career, because that's costing them money and it's costing them real dollars. We want to make sure that they can get through the other end, ultimately get the job they need and be contributing for themselves and for the broader community.
What I'm hearing you say is that the Montgomery County public school system is failing these students and not educating them properly.
No, and that's not. I don't think it's not a failure. It's a recognition that we had 2.5 years that we couldn't provide education in a way that people learn how to provide education. And unfortunately, we see this across the entire country. And so I think the school system is trying to figure out how to remedy that and put tools in place. But that doesn't mean that there's still not going to be a cohort of students that are still going to have those challenges that travel with them. And so I think the educational system as a whole has got to recognize that and be able to provide the tools to help those students over that 2.5-year gap that many of them missed.
Well, but if Mark, I'm going to give you this question, because if Montgomery County is having to devote a lot of resources to bring students up to par for them to be successful in their programs, that means there's a huge number of students in our system that aren't being properly educated. And what this report suggests is that we may need to send them all back for another year of schooling. Is that the answer?
Well, I don't know. It's a complete gap here. Let's talk about kind of the broader issue, which is there's a real contrast in the philosophy of the way education should be conducted. And on one hand, we have sort of the Kerwin-Thornton tradition of, let's provide more resources, so that it's basically the structures and processes are in place. They just need to be funded more. Mike referenced early education as being one of the additional pieces to that. And that stands in contrast with an approach that involves sort of breaking up the one size fits all, the sort of factory school model in which the assumption is that students all learn in the same way. And that really would involve more in the way of choice, more in the way of a diversity of approaches for education. And there's a choice there. I mean, if you look at Wes Moore and you look at Dan Cox, that's an area in which on education and educational choice is a sharp contrast.
So, Mike, we haven't seen the same level of acrimony as exists across the river in some of the in Fairfax County and in the Loudoun County school systems. But there is a question as to whether or not the schools are spending sufficient time on the basics of education and rather on social programs. What's your answer to this?
No, I think well, I think yes, they are focusing on the basics. I think we've got to continue to double down on those basics, because I think, as you reported with the statistics earlier, we've got a lot of catching up to do, because students haven't had that 2-year hiatus, because they were effective. Many of them were online, but it clearly didn't have the same impact as actually being in person, which we knew was a reality. And so I think that personally, I think that the notion of we're focusing on social programming has been a great red herring for the folks in Virginia, and I think allowed Governor Youngkin to go into the governor's mansion. But I think the focus is on teaching kids how to learn and recognizing the world in which they're learning.
So, Marc, you mentioned the factory model of education. And in many ways, the public school education system was founded around the turn of between the 18th and 19th century. So it's more than 100 years old. Is it time for a change? There are those that advocate a completely free market solution where that all public education should be handled by the voucher system, that every kid who wants to be educated should get a voucher. It can go to a school of their choice.
Well, there are a variety of approaches. Obviously, charter schools are permitted in Maryland, not so much in Montgomery County. There are a variety of ways in which you can provide for the fact that students have different learning styles. And that's something that really needs to be incorporated to a much greater extent in our.
But also motivation. I mean, a lot of this comes from parental activity and parental motivation. And so shouldn't those parents who want and demand better educations for their children have that opportunity than being locked in the public school system?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there should be more choice. And I would point out that the way MCPS operates, the assumption is that parents are going to supplement their kids' education to a substantial degree.
Mike, I'm going to give you the last word because I know I hit a nerve with you.
That's okay. I think vouchers are actually an interesting approach. The reality is we have 165,000 students in Montgomery County. And I think from a private school perspective, I think they teach about 6,000 students in the private school. So vouchers aren't going to get very far to try and make sure that we can actually bridge that gap. So we've got to figure out how do we continue to teach our children better.
Well, I'll let you have the last word. This is for the 20 years that we've been on the air, we've been talking about the Montgomery County public school system on a continual and regular basis. And I'm sure we're going to in the future. Stay tuned for Parting Shots. Now with Parting Shots, Mike Knapp.
I'm just glad to see all of the arts organizations have weathered the storm from the pandemic and are opening back up and really have programming. And it's just nice to see that they've managed to get to the other side and that the cultural part of our community is back.
Thank you, Mike. Marc Uncapher, your parting shot.
Well, as we get ready to move into the voting season, as it is now, it's not too early to make sure you have a ballot. And if you vote by mail or make your plans to vote that way.
Thank you, Marc. I want to thank you both for being here today. I want to thank the audience for tuning in each and every week to Montgomery County's hardest hitting political talk show. For 21 this week, I'm Casey Aiken.